Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Brian McDermott case. It was a Sunday in early September in the year 1973. In the city of Belfast, Northern Ireland, the air was beginning to hold the crisp, sharp promise of autumn, though the sun still fought to warm the brickwork of the terraced houses. The city was a place of heavy silences and distant, rolling echoes in those days. A landscape where the weight of history felt present in every shadow and every cobblestone. But for a 10-year-old boy, it was simply the final breath of summer vacation. The school term at Euston Street Secondary was looming just 2 days away, and there was a quiet, nervous excitement in the air of the house on Wells Street. Imagine the smell of a 1970s Sunday, the slow roasting meat in the oven, the steam clinging to the kitchen windows, and the rhythmic tick of a clock on the mantel. It was a day for family, for rest, and for the simple joys of childhood before the routine of the classroom returned. Brian McDermott was a child of gentle spirit. To his mother, Joan, he was cheeky and lovable, a boy who might offer a small protest but would always, eventually, do as he was told. He was petite for his age, possessing a certain frailty that made those who loved him feel a natural, protective instinct. His older brother, Edward, had just returned from service in the army the night before, bringing a sense of completion to the household. The morning had been filled with the ordinary sounds of a large family, 5 children in total, with Brian as the youngest, the baby of the brood. He sat at the kitchen table, perhaps thinking of his new school uniform laid out and ready, or the fresh pencils that hadn't yet been sharpened. As the clock moved toward 12:30 in the afternoon, the restless energy of a 10-year-old boy began to stir. He asked to go to the park to play with his friends. It was a request so common, so unremarkable, that there was no reason to refuse it. He was told to be back by 2:30 for the family's Sunday lunch. Joan watched from the doorway as her youngest son stepped out onto Wells Street. The sun caught the light of his hair as he crossed the road, heading toward the green expanse of Ormeau Park. It was only a short walk, perhaps 10 minutes at a child's pace, through streets he knew as well as the lines on his own palm. The neighborhood was alive with the hum of a Sunday afternoon, the distant sound of a television through an open window, the muffled clatter of plates being dried in a neighbor's kitchen. Brian walked with a light step, his small frame eventually disappearing around the corner, moving toward the iron gates of the park. Ormeau Park was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the grass felt cool and damp underfoot even on a sunny day. The trees there were ancient and tall, their leaves just beginning to turn to shades of gold and copper, whispering in the light breeze that swept up from the River Lagan. Brian moved toward the playground, a place of rusted metal and heavy wooden seats, where the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and old earth. By 1 o'clock, the park was populated with the usual Sunday crowds. Families walked their dogs along the winding paths, and children's voices rose and fell like the tide. Brian was seen in the playground, a solitary figure amidst the movement. He was observed playing on the equipment, perhaps lingering by the swings where the chains groaned with a rhythmic, metallic creak as they moved through the air. The playground was a sensory tapestry, the cold touch of the iron bars, the rough texture of the hemp ropes, and the soft, crunching sound of gravel under scuffed shoes. Between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock that afternoon, Brian remained within the safety of those familiar boundaries. Witnesses would later recall a quiet boy, playing alone, seemingly content in his own world. The light of the afternoon began to shift, the shadows of the giant oaks stretching longer and thinner across the grass, reaching out like dark fingers toward the edges of the play area. The sun was no longer overhead. It was beginning its slow descent, bathing the park in a hazy, amber glow that made everything seem momentarily still and golden. Back at Wells Street, the hands of the clock reached 2:30. The Sunday lunch was ready, the steam rising from the plates in fragrant clouds. Joan looked toward the door, expecting the familiar sound of the latch and the tumble of footsteps that usually announced Brian's return. But the house remained quiet, save for the conversation of his older siblings. 2:30 became 2:45, and the food began to lose its heat, the gravy forming a thin skin on the surface. A subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the kitchen. The transition from mild annoyance at a child's lateness to the first, tiny spark of unease. They waited, thinking perhaps he had lost track of time, caught up in a game of football or a conversation with a friend. By 3 o'clock, the unease had grown into a tangible tension. The neighborhood outside was still bathed in that deceptive, peaceful light, but inside the McDermott home, the silence was becoming heavy. Every passing minute felt longer than the last, stretched thin by the growing realization that Brian was never late for his dinner. He was a boy of habit, a boy who knew the rules of the house. The search began with simple calls from the doorstep. His name was shouted into the cooling air of Wells Street, bouncing off the brick walls of the terraces. When there was no answer, the family set out, moving toward the park with a pace that quickened with every step. They checked the paths where he usually walked. They asked neighbors who were leaning over their garden gates. "Have you seen Brian?" A small boy, 10 years old, petite, wearing a dark sweater. But the answers were all the same. No, not since earlier. As they reached the gates of Ormeau Park, the vastness of the green space suddenly felt overwhelming. The playground was emptying now as other families headed home for their own Sunday meals. The swings stood empty, swaying slightly in the wind, their empty seats a haunting reminder of the life that had been there only an hour before. The sun was dipping lower, casting the hollows of the park into deep, violet shadow. The air turned cold, and the sound of the river Lagan, nearby and unseen, seemed to grow louder in the deepening dusk. Brian was nowhere to be found, and as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky over Belfast, the McDermott family realized that the quiet afternoon had transformed into a nightmare that was only just beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon on that Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1973, but the lights in the small, terraced houses along Wells Street did not flicker out. Instead, they spilled onto the pavement in long, yellow rectangles as front doors were flung wide, and neighbors stepped into the cooling air. The initial confusion of the afternoon had hardened into a sharp, cold dread that seemed to settle in the marrow of the community's bones. Men in heavy wool coats and women with scarves tied tight against the rising damp of the Belfast evening gathered in small clusters, their voices low and urgent. They carried heavy, silver flashlights that cut through the gathering gloom, the beams dancing off the rough, red brick walls and the slick, damp cobblestones. Every alleyway was probed. Every shadowed corner of the Woodstock Road area was illuminated, as the name of a 10-year-old boy was called out into the night. Brian. The name echoed, bouncing off the boarded-up windows of derelict shops and the heavy sandbags that lined the street corners, but the only response was the distant, rhythmic rumble of a Saracen armored car patrolling several blocks away. Monday morning arrived with a cruel and rhythmic punctuality. For most families in East Belfast, it was a day of nervous excitement, the beginning of a new school term. The air should have been filled with the sound of children running toward the gates of Euston Street Secondary School, their voices high and bright. Instead, the streets felt hollowed out. Brian was supposed to be among them, stepping into a fresh start, perhaps wearing the crisp white t-shirt with the Nettlefield Primary School badge that his mother, Joan, had so carefully prepared. But his bed remained undisturbed, the sheets pulled tight and cold. As the sun struggled to break through a low, slate-gray ceiling of clouds, the search expanded. It was no longer just the neighbors of Wells Street. The Royal Ulster Constabulary and the British Army were now woven into the search effort. Soldiers in camouflage, their rifles slung low, moved through the high grass of Ormeau Park. They stepped carefully around the rusted swings and the empty slides where Brian had been seen playing just 24 hours earlier. The park, usually a sanctuary of green in a city defined by gray concrete and steel, now felt like a vast, silent witness that refused to speak. The geography of the search became increasingly grim as Tuesday and Wednesday bled into one another. Search parties moved away from the familiar playgrounds and toward the dark, industrial fringes of the city. They scoured the banks of the river Lagan, where the water moved like liquid lead, thick and secretive under the bridges. The smell of the river, a mix of salt, old silt, and industrial runoff, clung to the clothes of the volunteers. They pushed through the dense undergrowth and tangled briars of Tullamore Forest Park, the thorns catching on their sleeves as they called into the deep silence of the woods. In the Sydenham and Drumbo areas, investigators moved through derelict buildings that stood like hollow teeth along the city's skyline. Inside these crumbling structures, the air was thick with the scent of wet plaster and ancient dust. The searchers stepped over shattered glass and rotted floorboards, their flashlights revealing nothing but the ghosts of former lives. A discarded shoe, a tattered newspaper from 5 years prior, the scurrying of a rat in the rafters. Each empty room was a fresh heartbreak, a vanishing point where the trail simply ended. Inside the house on Well Street, time had become a heavy, viscous thing. Every tick of the clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer blow against the silence. Joan sat by the front window, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were as white as the lace curtains she stared through. She watched the street, waiting for the familiar silhouette of her youngest son to round the corner, perhaps running a little late, perhaps with a scraped knee and a story to tell. Her husband, Edward, paced the narrow confines of the kitchen, the smell of untouched tea growing cold on the table. The atmosphere of the Troubles, always a low-frequency hum in the background of Belfast life, now felt suffocating. Even the local paramilitary groups, usually preoccupied with the violent politics of the era, felt the weight of the moment. The Ulster Defence Association offered a reward of £500, an enormous sum for the time, and promised their thousands of members would keep watch. For a brief, flickering moment, the deep sectarian divides of the city seemed to thin, eclipsed by the primal, universal terror of a lost child. But as Thursday arrived and the search turned toward the community relations camp at Helens Bay, the hope began to fray at the edges, replaced by a cold, numbing exhaustion. By the 6th day, a dark vapor of rumor began to circulate through the local shops and pubs. People spoke in hushed tones of suspicious figures seen near the Balfour Avenue bonfire, site on the night Brian disappeared. They talked of a stocky man with a thick neck, of strange sights near the Belfast Boat Club, and of the terrifying possibility that this wasn't just a disappearance, but something far more calculated and sinister. The weight had moved past the point of endurance. The McDermott family remained trapped in a silent vigil, their home a fortress of grief, where every knock on the door brought a surge of adrenaline followed by the crushing weight of disappointment. The city of Belfast, usually so loud with the sounds of industry and unrest, seemed to hold its breath. The River Lagan continued its slow, indifferent crawl toward the sea, carrying with it the secrets of the week. Down at the embankments, the army patrols continued their watch, their eyes scanning the surface of the water where the light of the setting sun shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of orange and gold. The 7 days were nearly up, and the vanishing point was about to reveal the horror it had been hiding in the shadows. The River Lagan has always been a quiet observer of Belfast's long and winding history. In the early days of September 1973, its waters were particularly heavy, carrying the weight of autumn and the secrets of a city under immense strain. The air hanging over the Annandale embankment was thick with the scent of damp earth and the cooling breath of the coming winter. Near the Belfast Boat Club, the water moves with a sluggish, rhythmic pulse, lapping gently against the muddy banks where the reeds sway in slow, mournful arcs. On the 8th of September, 6 days after the 10-year-old boy had vanished from the playground, the river was forced to give up what it held. The authorities had decided to lower the water level, a process that revealed the hidden topology of the riverbed, exposing the slick, gray silt and the debris that had been swallowed by the depths. As the water retreated, it left behind a landscape of glistening mud and the sharp, metallic tang of the river's breath. It was in this exposed, vulnerable state of the river that a specific shape began to emerge from the muck, something that did not belong to the natural world of stones and sediment. A simple, rough-hewn hessian sack lay partially submerged, its coarse fibers soaked through with the cold, dark water, caught against the jagged edge of the bank like a discarded thought. When the officers of the Royal Ulster Constabulary approached the embankment, the world seemed to grow unnaturally still. The distant hum of the city, usually punctuated by the sounds of the troubles, faded into a heavy, expectant silence. Their boots crunched softly on the gravel and sank into the soft, yielding mud of the riverbank. The sack was heavy, weighted down not just by the water it had absorbed, but by a density that suggested something far more substantial than river refuse. As they reached for it, the texture of the burlap was rough and abrasive against their gloves, the material stiff with the cold. There was no immediate movement, no sound but the occasional drip of water from the reeds. The task of opening that sack was one that would haunt the memories of those present for decades to come. The knots were tight, swollen by the moisture, requiring a slow and deliberate effort to undo. As the fabric finally gave way, the reality of what lay inside began to manifest in the dim light of the afternoon. It was a discovery that transcended the typical violence of the era, a crime so singular in its cruelty that it seemed to stop the very heart of the community. Inside the damp, dark enclosure of the hessian were the charred and partial remains of a small child, a sight that defied the logic of the world they knew. The nature of the crime was nothing short of horrific, a visceral nightmare carved into the physical world. The remains were not whole. The small body had been dismembered with a chilling, methodical precision. Both of the child's legs were missing, and one of his arms had been taken as well. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence of fire. The torso had been badly burned, the skin charred to a deep, unrecognizable charcoal, a detail that suggested a desperate and violent attempt to erase the child's identity, or perhaps something even more sinister. The smell that rose from the sack was a sickening mixture of the river's stagnant rot and the sharp, acrid ghost of a fire that should never have been lit. Forensic science in 1973 was a far cry from the digital precision we know today. There were no rapid DNA profiles to be run, no high-resolution databases to consult. The investigators were left with the most basic and physical of clues. The body was so badly damaged by the heat and the water that traditional visual identification was nearly impossible. The features that his parents would have known, the shape of his nose, the curve of his smile, had been stolen by the flames. The scene was a masterclass in forensic frustration, set against the backdrop of a riverbank that seemed to pull the warmth from the very bones of the men standing there. Despite the immense damage, there was one fragile bridge back to the boy's identity. On the single remaining hand, the skin had been preserved just enough for the experts to attempt the impossible. With painstaking care, in a laboratory filled with the low hum of ancient equipment and the sterile scent of chemicals, they worked to retrieve a set of fingerprints. It was a slow, delicate process, one that required the utmost patience as they cleaned and prepared the small, darkened fingertips. Each ridge and whorl was a map of a life that had only just begun to find its way. When the prints were finally compared to the records, the truth was confirmed with a final, crushing weight. This was Brian McDermott. The quiet, timid boy who was so petrified of the water had been returned to his family by the very river he feared. The realization sent a shockwave through the investigation. This wasn't a stray bullet or a political statement. This was a predatory act of unimaginable depravity. The Royal Ulster Constabulary found themselves facing a forensic puzzle that offered more questions than answers. Where were the missing limbs? Why had the killer used fire in such a specific, localized way? The embankment became a place of shadows, where every stone and every ripple in the lagan felt like a witness that refused to speak. The forensic challenges were compounded by the environment of the 1970s. In a city where the police were often occupied by the macro-violence of civil unrest, a micro-tragedy of this scale required a different kind of focus. The officers searched the mud for days, their eyes scanning the gray silt for any sign of the missing pieces of Brian's body. They waded through the shallows, their long coats heavy with the mist, feeling the numbing cold of the water seep into their skin. They found nothing more. The river held onto the rest of the boy with a stubborn, watery grip. The investigation was forced to rely on the physical state of the remains found in that sack. The medical examiners noted the surgical nature of the dismemberment, a detail that pointed toward someone with a specific knowledge of anatomy or a terrifyingly cold composure. There were no struggle marks that could be identified on the charred skin, no fibers that didn't belong to the burlap or the river. The case was becoming a ghost story before it was even a week old. The city watched from a distance, the people of East Belfast drawing their curtains a little earlier each night, the silence of the streets reflecting the silence of the evidence. The forensic team worked through the night under the glow of yellowed lamps, looking at the same few clues over and over, hoping for a breakthrough that the muddy banks of the lagan simply would not yield. As the days passed, the weight of the discovery at the Annandale embankment settled into the bones of the city. The image of that Hessian sack became a symbol of a darkness that bypassed the political and struck at the very core of human safety. The police gathered what they could: the fingerprints, the descriptions of the burlap, the specific temperature required to cause such charring. But the trail was as cold as the river itself. They looked at the way the sack had been tied, the specific knots used, wondering if they revealed the hands of a sailor, a butcher, or a laborer. Every detail was scrutinized until it was worn thin, yet the person who had stood on that embankment and let the sack slip into the water remained a shadow. The forensic challenges were not just technical, they were emotional. To handle the remains of a child treated with such clinical brutality took a toll on the men in the white coats and the officers on the beat. They moved through their tasks with a somber, heavy rhythm, their voices low and respectful in the presence of such profound loss. The river continued to flow, oblivious to the trauma it had carried, its surface reflecting the gray Belfast sky. The mystery of what happened between the playground and the embankment was now a void, a silent space in the narrative that no amount of searching seemed able to fill. The investigation was standing on the edge of a long, dark corridor, and the light was beginning to fade. The discovery at the river did more than just break the hearts of a family. It fractured the very sense of safety that the people of Belfast had managed to cling to, even amidst the heavy tension of the early 1970s. As the news of the Hessian sack and its contents spread through the brick-lined streets of the East, a new and more primal kind of shadow began to stretch over the city. It was no longer just the fear of a stray bullet or a sudden blast that kept parents awake at night. Now there was a whisper of something older, something deeply unsettling that seemed to belong to another century entirely. The air in those September weeks felt thick, laden with the smell of damp earth and the lingering smoke from thousands of coal fires that drifted like low-hanging spirits over the rooftops. People began to look at the familiar landscape of Ormeau Park with a different set of eyes. The towering trees, which had once offered a peaceful canopy for afternoon strolls, now seemed to stand like silent, brooding sentinels guarding secrets that no one truly wanted to uncover. The river itself, the slow and tidal lagan, moved with a heavy, oily consistency, its surface reflecting the gray, bruised clouds of a northern Irish autumn. Every splash of water against the embankment wall sounded like a footfall, and every rustle of the dry, fallen leaves felt like a warning. Within days of the investigation's start, a strange and terrifying word began to appear in the headlines and the hushed conversations of the local pubs: a cult. To understand why this theory took such a firm hold on the collective psyche of the city, we have to look back just a few weeks prior to that fateful September. In August of 1973, reports had emerged from the Copeland Islands, just off the coast of County Down. There, among the salt-cracked rocks and the crashing spray of the North Channel, locals had found evidence of what appeared to be ritualistic sacrifices. 4 sheep had been found dead, their bodies arranged in patterns that suggested a dark intent, surrounded by symbols that few could name, but all could fear. The newspapers at the time had screamed about black magic on the beaches, fueling a growing panic about satanic cults operating in the shadows of the conflict. When the details of what had happened to young Brian McDermott began to leak, the horrific nature of the disfigurement and the evidence of fire, the public's mind didn't jump to the typical violence of the era. Instead, it reached for the supernatural. The city became a breeding ground for rumors of a black mass, of hooded figures meeting in the ruins of old buildings, and of a darkness that required a sacrifice. The authorities found themselves in the strange position of having to investigate not just suspects, but folklore. Detectives, accustomed to the gritty realities of street-level crime, found themselves poring over books on ancient rituals and speaking with experts on the arcane. They walked the perimeter of Ormeau Park, searching for more than just physical evidence. They were looking for signs of the unusual. They examined the way the grass was matted down in the secluded groves, looking for circles or symbols carved into the bark of the venerable oaks. The park, designed in the mid-19th century by the young architect Timothy Heavy, was a masterwork of Victorian landscaping, filled with winding paths and sudden, hidden clearings. At night, under the flickering, amber glow of the old streetlights, these clearings became pockets of absolute darkness. The police received hundreds of anonymous tips, many of them describing strange lights seen moving through the trees after the gates had officially closed at dusk. There were stories of chanting heard over the sound of the wind, and of animals found mutilated in the nearby woods. It was as if the city's trauma had manifested into a physical boogeyman. Even the British Army's secretive psychological operations units were whispered to be involved, allegedly creating mock ritual sites to further confuse and terrify a population already on the brink. The line between reality and black propaganda blurred until the truth was buried under layers of superstition and fear. Inside the homes of South and East Belfast, the atmosphere was one of profound mourning mixed with an almost physical dread. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood, the rattle of the milkman's bottles in the early morning, the distant chime of church bells, seemed muffled, as if the city was holding its breath. Mothers would stand at their front doors, watching the clock with a tightening in their chests, calling their children inside long before the sun had even begun to dip below the horizon. The vibrant life of the park, which had once been the lungs of the city, was suddenly choked off. The swings in the playground sat still, their chains occasionally creaking in a light breeze, sounding like a high-pitched moan. The wooden benches, smoothed by years of use, were now empty and damp with the evening mist. Investigators sat in the back of their patrol cars, the glowing embers of their cigarettes the only light in the dark, watching the river. They watched the way the tide pulled at the reeds and the way the shadows of the bridges stretched across the water like long, reaching fingers. They were looking for a person, but the city was convinced they were hunting a demon. Every creak of a floorboard in an old house and every unexplained shadow in an alleyway became part of the legend of the boy in the park, a story that was becoming more mythic and more terrifying with every passing hour. As the investigation into these ritualistic theories deepened, the police had to navigate a labyrinth of misinformation. The 1970s were a time of great upheaval, and the occult scare was a symptom of a society under immense pressure. Some believed the rumors were a convenient distraction, while others were convinced that a genuine evil had taken root in the heart of Belfast. Detectives interviewed members of the local community, asking about anyone seen carrying unusual items near the river, large sacks, candles, or strange garments. They looked into the history of the Annandale embankment, trying to find any precedent for such a gruesome act. The silence they met was not always one of evasion. Often, it was the silence of people who simply could not find the words to describe what they feared was happening in their midst. The sensory details of the case were overwhelming. The smell of the river's mud, the coldness of the station's interrogation rooms, and the haunting, high-pitched whistle of the wind through the park's railings. Every piece of evidence was handled with a mixture of professional detachment and a quiet, underlying revulsion. The Hessian sack itself, now a grim artifact in a police evidence room, seemed to radiate a coldness that no heater could touch. It sat there, a coarse and stained reminder of a young life extinguished in a way that defied all logic and all mercy. By the end of that first month, the shadows of the occult had become a permanent part of the investigation's history. While the police would eventually shift their focus back toward more earthly suspects, the damage to the city's peace of mind was done. The idea that a child could be taken from a public playground and subjected to such a horrific end, potentially as part of a ritual, left a scar that never truly healed. The people of Belfast learned to live with a new kind of ghost, one that didn't wear a uniform or carry a political banner, but one that lived in the dark spaces between the trees and the deep, cold currents of the river. The investigation continued to move forward, driven by a desperate need for answers, but the path was winding and obscured by the fog of rumor. As the nights grew longer and the winter of 1973 approached, the search for the truth about what happened to Brian McDermott in Ormeau Park would lead the authorities into even darker corners, where the monsters were not made of shadows, but of flesh and blood. The investigation was far from over, and the next turn in the road would bring them face to face with a different kind of horror, one that hid in plain sight, protected by the very institutions meant to keep the vulnerable safe. The years following 1973 did not bring the clarity the city of Belfast so desperately craved. Instead, the investigation into the death of young Brian McDermott seemed to dissolve into the damp, gray fog that frequently rolled off the River Lagan. The police files, once crisp and filled with the frantic energy of a fresh manhunt, began to settle. They grew heavy with the weight of unanswered questions, their edges yellowing in the stale air of basement archives. In the neighborhood of East Belfast, the silence was no longer just the absence of a child's laughter. It had become a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed against the windows of every home on Wells Street. The seasons changed. The biting winds of winter gave way to the pale, uncertain sun of spring. But for the McDermott family, time had frozen on that Sunday in September. The city around them was fractured by the Troubles, a landscape of checkpoints and distant sirens, where the tragedy of a single boy was often swallowed by the larger, louder roar of political upheaval. Yet, beneath that roar, a different kind of quiet was beginning to take root, a web of silence that stretched far beyond the gates of Ormeau Park. By the dawn of the 1980s, whispers that had once been dismissed as urban legend began to find a terrifying shape. The focus shifted toward a large, imposing building on the Newtonards Road, the Kincora boys' home. To the casual passerby, it was merely an institution, a place of brick and stone meant to provide shelter. But inside, the air was rumored to be cold, even in the height of summer. The hallways held a specific, institutional scent, a mix of floor wax, boiled cabbage, and a deep, underlying dread. It was here that a man named William McGrath held sway, a figure who moved through the shadows of loyalist politics and child care with a chilling ease. As investigators began to pull at the threads of Kincora, they found themselves entangled in a network that seemed to defy the standard logic of criminal inquiry. There were whispers of a honey-pot operation, a dark strategy where the suffering of the vulnerable was used as currency for blackmail and intelligence. The thought began to circulate, slow and sickening. Was it possible that the horrific fate of Brian McDermott was not an isolated act of madness, but a single, brutal stitch in a much larger, more systemic tapestry of abuse? In 1982, the silence was momentarily punctured by the sound of high-level meetings in London. Imagine a room paneled in dark mahogany, the air thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the rustle of heavy bond paper. Here, men with titles like Secretary of State and Lord Chancellor sat around a table, their voices low and measured as they discussed the potential links between a murdered 10-year-old boy and the mounting scandal at Kincora. There was Jim Pryor, Michael Havers, and Quinton Hogg, men who held the levers of power in their manicured hands. They looked at documents that suggested the Royal Ulster Constabulary was looking again at Brian's case, moving away from the theory of a sectarian killing and toward something far more intimate and organized. They spoke of individuals like a man named Campbell, who was said to have information, and they whispered about files that had mysteriously vanished or been mutilated. The contrast was jarring. The polished, hushed corridors of Westminster versus the muddy, blood-stained banks of the Lagan, where Brian's remains had been found. It was a realization that the truth was being weighed not just by its importance to a grieving mother, but by its potential to destabilize the very structures of the state. The feeling of being watched became a common sensation for those who tried to look too closely. An Army intelligence officer named Colin Wallace had even produced a memo in 1974, a document that explicitly connected the abuse at Kincora to the murder of Brian McDermott. He wrote of a circle of men, protected by their connections to intelligence services and paramilitary groups, who operated with a terrifying impunity. But his warnings were like stones dropped into a bottomless well. They made a small splash and then vanished into the dark. The investigation into Brian's death found itself hitting invisible walls. Leads would simply stop. Witnesses who had been vocal suddenly became gripped by a profound, elective amnesia. The web of silence was not just a lack of information. It was an active, breathing mechanism designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless. You can almost feel the frustration of the detectives who sat in cramped offices, surrounded by the hum of electric heaters and the smell of stale tea, staring at the same photographs of a smiling boy in a school sweater, knowing that the key to the mystery lay just behind a door they were forbidden to open. The systemic failure was not merely a matter of incompetence. It was a byproduct of a city at war with itself. In the chaos of the Troubles, when bombs were exploding in city centers and the streets were patrolled by armored vehicles, the disappearance of a child could be framed as a secondary concern. The predators knew this. They operated in the gaps between the checkpoints, in the derelict buildings that lined the edges of the parks, and within the institutions that were supposed to be sanctuaries. The case of Brian McDermott became a ghost that haunted the halls of justice, a reminder of what happens when the protection of the innocent is sacrificed for the preservation of the status quo. Even when the River Lagan was lowered and the silt-covered sack was pulled from the water, the truth remained submerged. Each time the file was reopened, in 1982, in 1993, and again in the early 2000s, the same names would surface and the same shadows of Kincora would loom. It was as if the investigation was walking in circles in a dark forest, always returning to the same gnarled tree, while the wind through the leaves whispered of secrets kept in high places. As the decade of the 1980s drew to a close, the Kincora scandal finally broke into the public consciousness, leading to convictions and outcries. But the connection to Brian remained an agonizing, perhaps. The official inquiries would eventually conclude that there was no direct evidence to link the home to his murder, yet the proximity and the timing remained too coincidental for many to accept. The web had been woven too tightly, and the threads were too tangled with the interests of national security and political stability. For the people of Belfast, the name Brian McDermott became synonymous with a loss of innocence that was twofold. First, the brutal loss of a young life, and second, the loss of faith in the institutions meant to serve and protect. The silence of the River Lagan, as it flowed quietly toward the sea, seemed to carry the weight of all those buried secrets. The city moved on, the buildings were replaced, and the park was renovated, but the shadow remained. It was a shadow that lived in the margins of the official reports, a persistent, chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those who hide in the bushes, but those who hide behind the desk and the uniform. The air in Belfast during late September has a particular weight to it. It is a dampness that clings to the wool of heavy coats and settles into the porous, gray stone of the Victorian terraces. 52 years have passed since that Sunday afternoon in 1973, yet for those who remember, the atmosphere of that day remains frozen. The city has transformed around the edges. The skyline is now etched with modern glass and the yellow steel of great cranes, but the River Lagan still flows with the same slow, tidal rhythm, whispering secrets into the muddy banks. Time is a curious thing in a place like this. It heals some wounds while leaving others to fester in the dark, and the story of Brian McDermott is a wound that has never truly closed. It is a narrative of a boy who simply stepped out into the sunlight of a summer Sunday and never stepped back. Even now, half a century later, the silence that followed his disappearance is louder than the city traffic. It is a silence made of unanswered questions, of files gathering dust in climate-controlled rooms, and of a family that was slowly, quietly pulled apart by the gravity of an impossible grief. Close your eyes and try to see the world as it was on September 2nd, 1973. It was the final day of the school's summer holidays, that bittersweet moment when the freedom of childhood meets the looming structure of a new term. Brian was just 10 years old. He was a small boy for his age, with a slight build and a face dusted with freckles. His hair was a bright, ginger red, catching the pale northern light as he sat in his home on Wells Street in the lower Woodstock Road area. He had spent the morning indoors, perhaps feeling that familiar mix of excitement and nerves for the next day, when he was due to start secondary school. He wore a simple white t-shirt adorned with his Nettlefield Primary School badge, cream-colored jeans, and sturdy black shoes. After a breakfast of buttered toast, the air in the small house felt heavy with the scent of Sunday tea and the muffled sounds of the neighborhood. Just before 1 o'clock, he told his mother, Joan, that he was going to play at Ormeau Park, only a few minutes away. She told him his dinner would be ready soon, and he promised to be back. That promise is a ghost that still haunts the street, a small voice lost to the wind that rustles the sycamore leaves in the park. Ormeau Park was a place of shadows and light that afternoon. Witnesses would later recall seeing a solitary boy playing near the swings between 1 and 3 o'clock, a tiny figure against the vast green of the lawns. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the Sunday dinner grew cold on the table, the McDermott home became a sanctuary of rising panic. By the time the police were called, the city was already sinking into the twilight of the Troubles, a time when a child's absence carried a weight of terror that modern peace cannot fully translate. For 6 long, agonizing days, the search continued. Then, on September 8th, the unthinkable happened. The River Lagan, usually a ribbon of calm through the city, revealed its terrible burden. Near the Belfast Boat Club, a Hessian sack was found. Inside were the charred, mutilated remains of a child. The brutality was beyond comprehension, a level of cruelty that shocked even a city hardened by political violence. Brian's mother, Joan, was destroyed by the news. She kept repeating one heartbreaking detail to anyone who would listen. Brian was terrified of the water. To find him there, in the cold, dark grip of the river, was a final, jagged irony that the family could never reconcile. The years that followed were a slow erosion of hope. Brian's parents, Joan and Edward, were never the same. Their home, once filled with the energy of 5 children, became a place of quiet shadows and the sharp, medicinal sting of alcohol as they tried to numb a pain that had no ending. They both passed away without ever knowing who took their youngest son, their lives consumed by the search for a justice that remained always just out of reach. In the decades since, the case has moved through the hands of many detectives, each one faced with the same wall of silence. There were whispers of a group of youths seen near a fire in the park that day, and a name, Wee Jock, that was overheard by a passerby. There were darker theories, too, whispers that Brian's death was caught in the orbit of the Kincora scandal, a victim of the same systemic rot we have explored. While some pointed fingers at Brian's own brother, William, who was questioned multiple times and maintained his innocence, no evidence ever held firm. The mystery became an eternal cold case, a dark cornerstone of Belfast's history that refuses to be forgotten. As we reach the 52nd anniversary of that tragic September day, the Legacy Investigation Branch still keeps the file open. They hope that somewhere, perhaps in a quiet house in a different corner of the world, someone still carries a memory that could unlock the truth. Perhaps a person who was a teenager then, now an elder, feels the weight of a secret they have kept for half a century. The city of Belfast is different now, more peaceful, more brightly lit. But if you walk through Ormeau Park as the sun begins to set, you can still feel the lingering chill of 1973. The playground where Brian last played has been replaced by newer equipment, but the trees are the same. They have grown taller, their roots deeper, witnessing the passing of generations. The memory of the boy with the red hair and the Nettlefield badge remains a part of the landscape, a reminder of the fragility of innocence and the enduring power of a story that remains unfinished. We leave him there now, in the quiet of the park, under the watchful gaze of the Belfast hills. The journey through these shadows has been long, and the path has often been difficult to walk. We have looked into the darkest corners of a city's past, and we have heard the echoes of voices that were silenced too soon. But as the night deepens, it is time to leave the mysteries behind. The river continues to flow, and the stars remain steady above the Irish Sea. There is nothing more for us to solve tonight. The air is still, the world is quiet, and the heavy weight of the past is lifting, replaced by the soft, rhythmic pull of sleep. Let the questions dissolve into the dark. You have done enough by remembering. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.